What happens when a fading empire tries to reclaim its lost glory, and instead suffers one of the most humiliating defeats in its history? In the freezing forests and dangerous coastlines of northern Europe, two ancient rivals once again marched toward war. Sweden, desperate to restore the power it had lost after the Great Northern War, believed Russia was weak, distracted, and vulnerable. But the gamble would backfire in spectacular fashion. The conflict known as the Russo-Swedish War of 1741 to 1743 became a brutal struggle filled with political conspiracies, military disasters, collapsing strategies, starving soldiers, and shifting empires. It was a war that would permanently change the balance of power in the Baltic region forever. This is the story of ambition, revenge, betrayal, and the final collapse of Sweden's dream to dominate the North. Chapter 1. Europe after the Great Northern War. The early 18th century was an age of exhausted empires. For more than 20 years, Europe had watched the Great Northern War tear apart the Baltic world. At the center of that catastrophe stood Sweden, once feared across the continent as one of Europe's greatest military powers. During the 17th century, Sweden had transformed itself from a small northern kingdom into a massive empire. Swedish armies crossed frozen rivers, conquered powerful enemies, and dominated the Baltic Sea. Under legendary kings like Gustavus Adolphus and Charles Xide, Sweden earned a reputation for discipline, speed, and fearless aggression. But all empires eventually faced their reckoning. The Great Northern War shattered Swedish supremacy. Russia, under the leadership of Peter the Great, modernized its military and crushed Sweden at the decisive Battle of Poltava in 1709. That defeat destroyed Sweden's aura of invincibility. By the time peace finally arrived in 1721, Sweden had lost enormous territories and much of its influence in northern Europe. Russia emerged as the new dominant power of the Baltic region. For Sweden, the humiliation never faded. Many Swedish nobles, officers, and politicians dreamed of revenge. They believed Sweden could still reclaim its lost provinces if the right opportunity appeared. And eventually, they believed that opportunity had arrived. Chapter 2. Russia after Peter the Great. Peter the Great died in 1725. His death created uncertainty inside the Russian Empire. Although Peter had transformed Russia into a powerful modern state, the years following his death were filled with palace conspiracies, political instability, and struggles for succession. Several rulers came and went in rapid succession. Noble factions competed for influence at court. Military leaders fought for political advantage. Foreign observers began to wonder whether Russia's rise might slow down. In Stockholm, Swedish politicians watched carefully. One political faction in particular became increasingly aggressive. They were known as the Hats. The Hats were deeply nationalist and strongly anti-Russian. They believed Sweden's honor could only be restored through war. According to them, Russia's political instability created the perfect chance to recover the territories Sweden had lost decades earlier. The Hats also received encouragement from France. France wanted to weaken Russia because Russia supported Austria during the larger European power struggles of the time. French diplomats quietly encouraged Sweden to attack. Promises were made. Swedish leaders convinced themselves that Russia was vulnerable. It was a dangerous illusion. Chapter 3. Sweden prepares for war. In 1741, Sweden began moving toward open conflict. The Swedish government believed the Russian army was poorly organized and distracted by internal political problems. Swedish generals promised quick victories. Many politicians imagined dramatic military triumphs that would restore Sweden's prestige overnight. But beneath the patriotic speeches, Sweden faced serious problems. The army lacked preparation. Supplies were insufficient. Command structures were confused. Communication between leaders was weak. Even worse, Sweden underestimated the strength of modern Russia. Since Peter the Great's reforms, Russia had developed a much larger military system than Sweden could easily match. Russian resources, manpower, and industrial capacity were expanding rapidly. Still, enthusiasm for war continued to grow. In July 1741, Sweden officially declared war on Russia. The Russo-Swedish War had begun. Chapter 4. A war built on false assumptions. From the beginning, the Swedish strategy depended on unrealistic expectations. Swedish leaders believed Russia would collapse politically before serious fighting even began. They also expected internal rebellions within Russia. Neither happened. Instead, Russian authorities reacted quickly. The Russian military mobilized faster than Swedish planners expected.
Russian commanders secured defensive positions and prepared for a major campaign in Finland, which at the time belonged to Sweden. Finland immediately became the central battlefield. For centuries, Finland had served as a strategic buffer between Sweden and Russia. Whoever controlled Finland gained enormous military advantages in the Baltic region. As armies marched east and west across forests, lakes, and rough terrain, ordinary civilians faced disaster. Villages emptied, trade collapsed, food shortages spread. Fear followed the advancing armies, and the worst battles had not even begun. Chapter 5. The Crisis Inside Russia. Ironically, Sweden's declaration of war did coincide with a dramatic political crisis in Russia. In late 1741, a palace coup erupted in St. Petersburg. Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, seized power and became Empress of Russia. The coup was bold and dramatic. Russian guards loyal to Elizabeth arrested rival officials and secured control of the government. For a moment, Swedish leaders believed this chaos would guarantee victory, but the opposite happened. Elizabeth quickly stabilized the government. The Russian military remained loyal. Instead of weakening Russia, the new empress strengthened national unity. Russian officers now fought under the banner of Peter the Great's daughter, which boosted morale across the empire. Sweden had hoped to exploit Russian instability. Instead, the war helped unify Russia politically. Chapter 6. The Campaign in Finland. The main Russian offensive targeted Finland. Russian armies moved steadily through the region, using superior numbers and logistics. Swedish defenses struggled almost immediately. Many Swedish troops lacked adequate supplies. Coordination between commanders frequently failed. Roads became muddy disasters during bad weather. Disease spread through camps. Meanwhile, Russian forces captured strategic positions one after another. The Russian army advanced methodically. Fortresses fell. Towns surrendered. Swedish retreat followed Swedish retreat. One of the greatest problems for Sweden was leadership. Several commanders disagreed with one another and lacked confidence in the overall strategy. Some officers wanted aggressive attacks. Others preferred defensive operations. The confusion weakened Sweden's ability to respond effectively. Russian commanders exploited every mistake. Chapter 7. Finnish civilians in the middle of war. For ordinary people living in Finland, the war became a nightmare. Civilians suffered from occupation, looting, forced labor, and displacement. Families abandoned farms to escape advancing armies. Food became increasingly scarce. Many villages were destroyed. The Russian occupation of Finland during this period later became known in Finnish history as the Lesser Wrath. The term reflected widespread suffering and fear. Although conditions were not as catastrophic as during the earlier Russian occupation in the Great Northern War, the trauma remained severe. Peasants struggled to survive between two competing empires. Some communities faced pressure to support occupying troops. Others lost everything to disease and hunger. War was never only about kings and generals. For civilians, survival itself became the battlefield. Chapter 8. Swedish military collapse. As the campaign continued, Swedish hopes for victory disappeared. Russian offensives became increasingly effective. Swedish forces retreated deeper into Finland. Morale collapsed. Many soldiers realized the war had been launched without proper preparation. The dream of restoring Sweden's empire now seemed impossible. Russian troops captured the important city of Obo, known today as Turku. This victory further strengthened Russian control over Finland. At sea, Sweden also faced major difficulties. The Russian Navy had grown significantly since the time of Peter the Great. Russian naval forces challenged Swedish influence throughout the Baltic region. Sweden no longer possessed the overwhelming military superiority it once enjoyed. The balance of power had changed permanently. Chapter 9. The failure of Swedish strategy. Why did Sweden fail so badly? Historians point to several critical reasons. First, Sweden completely underestimated Russia. Russian military reforms over previous decades had created a much stronger state than many Swedish politicians understood. Second, Sweden overestimated foreign support. France encouraged Sweden politically but did not provide enough practical assistance to guarantee success. Third, Swedish planning was weak. The army lacked proper coordination, logistics, and strategic clarity. Fourth, internal disagreements among commanders damaged military effectiveness. And finally, Sweden's economic resources simply could not match Russia's expanding empire. The war revealed a painful truth. Sweden was no longer a great military superpower. Russia now dominated Northern Europe. Chapter 10. Elizabeth of Russia strengthens the empire. Empress Elizabeth emerged from the war politically stronger. Her successful leadership during the conflict increased her legitimacy inside Russia. The victory demonstrated that the Russian Empire remained powerful despite political instability after Peter the Great's death. Russian prestige grew across Europe. Foreign diplomats recognized that Russia could no longer be treated as a secondary northern state. Instead, Russia had become one of you.